So today I'm going to talk about the difference between educational categories and medical diagnoses. They are not necessarily going to be one and the same. IDEA, which is the law that brings us wonderful IEPs, has 13 categories of disability. One of them is actually called developmental delay, and that ceases to be a valid category after age 9. So I don't know why it's in there, but it is. And then there's other ones that a student has to meet in order to be considered for special education services. Now, remember that special education services are specifically designed instruction. So if your child does not meet a need for specially designed instruction, then they are not going to be getting a IEP. So, and that's why there's a difference that's an example of how there's a difference between a medical diagnosis and a special education disability category. So like, for example, a child could have ADHD, which is diagnosed by a psychologist, so it's a valid medical diagnosis, but in school, they may not actually meet criteria for a educational category for special education because their ADHD, which is actually not its own category and falls under other health impairment, does not impact their academic performance. They are not behind in anything. And like the main way to think of it is, are they able to access the regular curriculum? So if they can do everything in the regular curriculum and they're not showing any signs of not being able to read or not being able to do math or anything like that because of their ADHD, then they're not going to get that category. Now, if they have ADHD and then they're evaluated for special education and it turns out that they have dyslexia, then yeah, they could definitely qualify under specific learning disability. But you'll note that dyslexia is not a medical diagnosis. So medical diagnoses are going to be something that appears in like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, or there's the ICD book, which is the codes for all kinds of medical conditions, like anything you can basically think of. Now for education, most of that is going to be based on this book right here, which is called the EDM, the Educator's Diagnostic Manual of Disabilities and Disorders. It is by Roger Pierangelo and George Giuliani. I got an old version, a used one on Amazon for like $8. And I will be honest, it's a little out of date because it still has the incorrect categories for autism, like the incorrect medical categories for autism, but it doesn't really matter that much. It not only talks about the different categories and what each one would look like, it also breaks down ways to write a really good long-term, short-term goal and outcomes for each condition. So that's really, really helpful when you're trying to write an IEP, especially if your kid is categorized with something and you're like, I have no idea what this is. It's probably not going to be the case that your kid is going to have a medical diagnosis and then have a completely different educational diagnosis, although it's possible. I should not say educational diagnosis. I mean educational category, because let's remember that school personnel are not authorized to diagnose anyone. Even the school psychologist is not really looking to diagnose. They are looking at how their classroom behavior and educational functionality are impacted. It's not even really diagnosing. So I meant to say educational categories, but anyway, that was my little aside. So that book is going to tell you all the different kinds of educational categories. It'll even have subcategories for you. So like there's different kinds of specific learning disabilities in there. So if you look at that book, you'll probably get a really good specific IEP because you can break it down to, they have an SLD, a specific learning disability of dyslexia, and then this particular kind of dyslexia, and that's what this looks like, and here's what interventions we could do to address it. So it's going to be really, really good. So that is my pro tip for you. But yes, it is possible your child could have a medical diagnosis and then not have that category for their educational IEP. I haven't really seen anything as crazy as like, oh, they have autism as a medical diagnosis, but then aren't autism for education, but it could happen. So don't be alarmed if your kid's eval comes back and you're like, the hell is this? This doesn't look anything like my kid, and these aren't the same things at all. It's you can obviously request an independent education eval if you want to, and you probably should if you think that it seems funky, but it's not that weird. And then also remember too that some education categories like specific learning disability is not a medical diagnosis. So you're not going to see dyslexia on your doctor's notes or anything like that. And anything educational is usually not covered by insurance. So it's going to be like all the things that are not going to appear as a medical diagnosis. So yeah, definitely check that book out, and I'll put a picture of it up so that you can get a closer look. Otherwise, though, just keep in mind that medical is not the same as educational, and if you want to prove that your kid's medical diagnosis is going to affect their education, you need to be able to describe what that looks like. I don't care if your kid has ADHD, you need to tell me how that ADHD is going to impact their education and their ability to function in a classroom without any modifications to the curriculum or any support services. If you can show that ADHD is going to impact them and keep them from being able to access the curriculum and their education in the same way as a non-disabled child, then bingo, you have a case. But if you can't do that, then you're probably not going to get that category.